Wow. Folks, you just saw a preview of the feature-length documentary film that is going to be upcoming called Bison: Return to Tribal Lands. Um, I only saw a little piece of it earlier, Jason, and like I said, the bits that I saw, were kind of uh, goosebump inducing, and even more so now that I just saw the whole thing. Not only just that incredible footage of the buffalo and the other wildlife and just the grassland ecosystems, but the story of the connection between these animals and people, yourself, included. So, um, let's talk about the clip that we just saw, and then we'll talk a little bit more in depth about the buffalo, what happened to them, why they declined, and what we're doing about it now. Sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good, David.
Yeah. So you watching that, I'm sure you've seen that clip, from start to finish a few times at this point. How does that make you feel?
Well, I'm really grateful, really to have the opportunity to work in my own home community, but to be able to work on restoration of a species like buffalo that has so much historical and cultural importance. It's really how we can move forward in healing our communities, but also healing our landscapes because what we had was imposed systems placed upon our people that didn't work. And so here we have an effort that can restore and rebalance and provide uh, a means to something better for our future. And so, being that I'm from that community and, working on behalf of my nieces and nephews, my grandchildren, but also my parents and my elders who had to go through some extremely difficult times and circumstances in the past, that we want to kind of stop that from happening anymore. We want to stop that intergenerational trauma and instead work on something that is much more positive and holistic for our future generations.
It really strikes me as probably the epitome of the idea that we talk a lot about at the National Wildlife Federation, of this idea of, when we save and we protect and we restore wildlife and our natural heritage, we're really helping ourselves. And in the instance of the cultural connections that you were just talking about and the personal connections, I can't think of a stronger example of that idea, and it really is powerful. And so, I'm thrilled that this film is going to be coming out, and the world will get to hear that story and hear your story in particular. Let's talk about bison, though. Buffalo, as we said at the beginning, either term works, right? I'm probably going to say both throughout the rest of this live stream.
I say both all the time.
Yeah. So for everybody watching, help explain to them, this idea that these animals were once so incredibly abundant here in North America, and that they almost disappeared. What happened?
Well, we can estimate that there were 30 to 60 million bison when Lewis and Clark came west in 1804. And the contention with westward expansion, settler colonialism, and gold and everything that came with European arrival was contrary to the way that the people lived on this continent. And with further skirmishes and challenge for land, we could look back to the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where General George Armstrong Custer was killed and the Seventh Cavalry was defeated by the Ogallala and the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. That event and prior events, but really that one encouraged congressional slaughter of buffalo, really to eliminate the food source for Native people, and this really allowed for the tribes to be forced onto reservations. The buffalo was eliminated by in 1902, just roughly 100 years later after Lewis and Clark. There was only 23 buffalo left in Yellowstone. less than 1,000 on the entire continent. And so this was a way that we were subjugated as Native people. There are today 570 some federally recognized tribes. Some of those tribes are not even recognized anymore. We went from 330 languages to less than around 30 to 40 that are still fluently spoken and are still declining. And so that history of buffalo is very similar to the history of our Native people, in that we are now on remnants of our once former vast territories, Native people on reservations, buffalo in parks and refuges and private ranches. I had an opportunity to go to East Africa, David, and witness the wildebeest migration, and to see 1.5 million animals in the Serengeti and the Masai Mara. Really, what helped to change the trajectory of my life. When I came home, I wanted to know more about our own Serengeti, our buffalo population, our Native people, and the history of the United States, and what we can do today to make things better. And it always has been foundational for me to think that this buffalo, who was foundational to our people, can be again in a contemporary way. Uh, and so we have a lot of support. We got a lot of partners and people who can believe in what that is. And so I'm just very fortunate to be able to do this work.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And I had the good fortune to come out a few years ago and see this work firsthand with you. You showed me the beautiful landscape of the Eastern Shoshone Wind River Reservation, and I got to see Sundance. Not when Sundance was female, correct?
Yeah, and
Yeah,
Sundance
and
is big now. We can't
yeah,
even tell we're big which one she is because she's grown an adult. So
right. Yeah. She was not as small as we saw in the video there, but she was still pretty young. So, to be able, I mean, I still tell that story to this day when I'm talking about just some of the work that we do at the National Wildlife Federation and how just holy wow, getting to see the first bison calf born on that land in what was it, over 120 something years or something like that. And that was for me. I can only imagine what that felt like for you and for the rest of the folks that live on the reservation. I mean, it really is personal. This whole effort.
very personal. My dad is a retired biologist, and he worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He was in a unique position as a tribal member, but also a federal employee, working to uphold one of these concepts we call federal trust responsibility, and it goes back to treaties. And by Webster's own definition, treaties are supreme laws of the land. However, we have a history of broken promises and broken treaties. But in his position, he was able to work on behalf of the tribes and, as a trustee, work to promote conservation and restoration. So think of these two species, pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep. They were extirpated from the reservation prior to 1984, but because of his work, he was able to get some codes and regulations for under our tribal law implemented that protected our wildlife. It set seasons and bag limits on hunting, but it also allowed for the restoration of those species. So I got to witness the reintroduction of pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep to our reservation as a kid. And then my dad and I took that trip to East Africa and witnessed the wildebeest together. It was during that epiphany that I had standing there in the Serengeti looking at all these wildebeest and the 30 other species that are in amongst them about why don't we have more buffalo on our reservations? Not only our reservations, but in America, other than parks and refuges and private ranches. And so coming home, I always had this idea that buffalo restoration should look just like what we did with pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep. You go get these animals in their habitat and you bring them to their new habitat and you let them go and they multiply. With buffalo or bison, it's so much different because it's a contentious issue. There's the issue of disease. There's the issue of competition with livestock, um, and this essence of domestication. And what we saw within Native people, we didn't have a notion of wild or wilderness. But what came with European arrival was domestication, and and we now live in constructed environments. We have plowed up, paved over, fenced in, and fenced out. You know what is ours and what we perceive as ours, and that's so disconnected, I think, from our relationship with the natural world. And so for us as Native people, it makes sense that we should be able to go to a river and fish, or we should be able to drink water out of that river. We should be able to go hunt buffalo or elk or deer or moose or bighorn sheep or pronghorn antelope, because that's what our grandmas and grandpas have been doing for thousands of years. It's only been missing, especially buffalo, has only been missing for 130 years. For us, that seems like a long time. But if we look at the historical relationship of buffalo and our people, it's thousands and thousands of years. So 131 years is a small window when we look about how important those are in our genetics, in our DNA, and how important they are in our diet, but also our culture and our spiritual belief systems that they're still foundational to our ceremonies that we're able to continue to still practice today. So they're foundational to everything.
Yeah, it's this idea that people are separate from nature, and I think sadly, in many ways, we are, as you were just describing, with the just the way that we have evolved in sort of modern Western culture, in particular. This disconnected relationship with the natural world, with the land, with the water. But I always think about the idea that it doesn't have to be that way, right? We can actually be participants in our local ecology, and that can manifest in so many different ways. But I think this idea of raising, and restoring the population of this wild animal species, yet also consuming it, is a perfect example of that. And as long as it's done in a sustainable way, right? It's part of the cycle of nature. But I think that is a confusing point for a lot of folks, because they hear, bison, they were numerous, they almost disappeared. We're trying to do all this work to protect and restore them, but I can go to my local restaurant and buy a bison burger. And I think that confuses people, because they're like, if I can eat it in a restaurant, why is it such a big deal? Why are, there must be many of them out there. So can you talk about that, about this? And the film clearly gets into this sort of issue with domestication versus wild stock, and the interplay between the buffalo and cattle. Can you unpack some of that for the viewers out there, so it makes a little bit of more sense to them?
Sure. So, Lewis and Clark in 1804, they came west and witnessed 30 to 60 million bison. Within 100 years, they were nearly wiped out. And what happened was that the remaining animals were left in Yellowstone. There were about 5 individuals that recognized that, we got to do something. Some animals were taken to the Bronx Zoo. Teddy Roosevelt and William Hornaday started the American Bison Society. And there were animals established in a couple pockets of United States. So these animals had the pure genetics of those once large herds. But as cattle producers moved in, they recognized that buffalo were, well, I'm sorry, that cattle were somewhat susceptible to climate. Uh, they came from Europe. Cattle brought disease that infected wildlife species. But in an effort to make a stronger cow, they crossbred buffalo and cattle, creating hybrid species of cattle or beefalo. And that's what we term cattle gene introgression. And so the cattle genetics have been brought into the bison genome. Now, conservation and success stories and privatization has resulted in a large increase in the buffalo or bison population today, but 95% of that bison conservation has cattle gene introgression. we have less than 25,000 animals, bison, buffalo, that are genetically pure or genetically reputable. The Department of Interior manages 19 conservation populations. They ensure the best genetics are available, and some private producers have switched away from getting beefalo and cattle, and actually the National Bison Association passed a resolution not supporting cattle gene integration anymore. They want to improve the genetics of the private populations as well. But there is still a very small number of bison in total that have the purest genetics, and so really the bison genome is still under some level of threat. And so as we restore buffalo to our tribal communities, we can ensure that we want to be partners in conservation. We just don't want to get any buffalo from anywhere, uh, with not knowing the consequences down the road of what cattle gene integration means for the bison genome. We'll just start off as a conservation uh, emphasis and ensure that we can continue that. Now, Yellowstone has the the historic herd. There's now 5,000 animals in Yellowstone, and there's pretty contentious issues as bison leave Yellowstone National Park. Now, when cattle came west, they also brought disease that I mentioned that infected bison. So the disease issue is a whole nother can of worms. The Intertribal Buffalo Council, which is a tribal nonprofit organization, started in the 90s and it became a federally chartered organization, has a membership now of 76 tribes, and is working with tribal communities to restore these animals to our communities. And what we emphasize in that organization is that buffalo is actually and should be a treaty right, because if treaties were made and negotiated, then buffalo is as a food source was incredibly important in those negotiations and agreements that were originally made. And so buffalo is the one of the most nutritious meats. It's got the highest protein and trace minerals and lowest fat and cholesterol than almost any other meat. And so as colonization affected our grandmas and grandpas and the buffalo was eliminated as a food source, well, then that resulted in the highest rates of diabetes and heart disease and other health related issues in our native communities. So our, every one of our community members knows someone that's got diabetes. It's that prevalent. And so as we heal our communities, part of that is being able to ingest and eat this animal again. We call it life's commissary. For our grandmas and grandpas, this animal was food, clothing, shelter, a gift from Creator, and so it's central to our ceremonies. Our philosophical and spiritual understanding is all centered around our connection to this four-legged animal. But also, when we say all our relations, we're also talking about the winged ones, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl above and below the ground. In our language, we say Damat Neruwura in Shoshone, or in Arapaho, you say Besihi Neteinat, or in Lakota, you say Mutakuye Oyasin. Means all our relations. And when we utilize those types of terms and sayings, it's about reminding ourselves about that connection to the natural world, not only to the natural world, but all living things. We are all interconnected, and that's what that saying means. And that was a pretty widespread philosophical understanding that existed amongst Native people, that we are stewards, we are caretakers of these lands, waters, and animals. And so it's very, very important that we can continue uh, that type of a philosophy, that type of a worldview, land management, actually changing land use policies to be more reflective of that. as opposed to just continuing with the status quo of managing our lands for agriculture or utilizing our lands for grazing cattle. Well, we've been very successful as stewards at Wind River of managing our wildlife, managing the water, the air, and ensuring that we can exercise our self-determination and sovereignty, and in this effort, food sovereignty. So we're not only working on cultural revitalization, but ecological restoration. By putting this keystone species back, then we're improving the plant and animal biodiversity, we're increasing our access to our traditional foods and medicines, and we are healing ourselves from the inside out by being able to eat that animal again.
Yeah, again, a brilliant example of the idea that we human beings are part of our environment and we have a choice. We can choose to conduct our own, way of living in a way that degrades that for other species and other cultures, or we have a choice to figure out ways of living that help actually support that ecology, and in doing so, support, as you've been saying eloquently, our own health and our culture and our spirituality and all of those things. I want to make sure we have a chance to talk about the National Wildlife Federation Tribal Partnerships Program. And what you were just saying, I think is a good segue into that, because that particular branch of work that we're doing, that is the work that you do at the National Wildlife Federation, has had some pretty significant successes. And so can you just tell folks to wind us down here, what the program is, what its accomplishments have been, and if there's a way that people can get involved?
Yeah, so the you know National Wildlife Federation's motto, connecting people and connecting our places and animals. That motto of National Wildlife Federation fits very well with the way I was raised and what I came to understand about what wildlife is. And the Tribal Partnerships Program goes somewhat back. My dad was a biologist for the Fish and Wildlife Service. He was very, very focused on conservation and finding partners. National Wildlife Federation became his main partner in the 80s, decades ago, in supporting fisheries and water rights. He served on the board of directors for a number of years and helped to emphasize the importance of tribes. We can't talk about conservation without including tribes, because conservation is actually foundational to native belief systems. Indigenous people across the world have this idea of that not taking more than you need, and that's conservation. And so it makes a lot of sense for an organization like NWF to partner with tribes. And so, the longest running court case in the history of Wyoming is actually about who controls water on the reservation. And the tribes fought for a number of years to protect water and fisheries. National Wildlife Federation was a partner with the tribes in that lawsuit. Now, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of getting water and fisheries restored at Wind River. But the Tribal Partnerships Program and its entity works with many tribes across the Southwest, across the West, to ensure that we can be better partners in supporting tribal sovereignty and supporting tribal self-determination, whether that's in conservation or food sovereignty or restoring a river. NWF has the ability, because of our constituency, to be able to provide incredible financial as well as other types of support for tribes working in this arena. So the Tribal Partnerships Program, you can link up to the site down below and find out a lot about our work. I primarily work with tribes around Buffalo, but my other colleagues work with tribes in the Colorado River Basin. And so, with this effort, we really feel that we can be better partners to tribes in our regions. And so we're actually working on a a national tribal strategy to ensure that all of our offices across National Wildlife Federation can meaningfully consult and work with those tribes in our regions to build our capacity to do more in terms of conservation and working with our tribes. Because tribes are unique entities in this nation. We're the only ethnic group that contains or carries sovereignty and self-determination, even though we're, between 2 and 4% of the population. We have a land base. And this is because, again, of treaties. And so this history is very important to understand. There's actually 7 eras of federal Indian law and policy that lead us to where we are today. And so, in a lot of our discussions with folks and building collaborative efforts, it's to really remind folks that, these treaties were made, they've been broken, but tribes still have sovereignty and self determination, and they're still working to heal. And those overlap very well with the priorities of not only the National Wildlife Federation, but really what we can do within the Tribal Partnerships Program.
Yeah, and again, another great example of how in conservation, sometimes it's about going out and saving and protecting and restoring species or populations. But in many ways, one of the most effective ways at doing that for wildlife is investing in human communities and supporting people and in this case tribes. And it was just such an incredible suite of programs that I am, I feel very proud to know that you guys are out there doing that work, even though I'm not really directly involved in it myself. But let's quickly talk about the bison. So how many bison have been reintroduced on the Wind River Reservation to date?
So the Eastern Shoshone Tribe has 66 buffalo, and the Northern Arapaho Tribe has 32. And so within National Wildlife Federation, we build the relationships with the tribes so that we can meet their terms. And I mentioned earlier that National Wildlife Federation has a relationship with the Wind River tribes that goes back decades, and because of that, I've been able to build resolution or government-based support for partnering with National Wildlife Federation, so we can assist both tribes because they're 2 government entities. Assist both tribes collaboratively and simultaneously to get towards where we want to see, and that is buffalo managed as wildlife. Now, it's a piecemeal approach to get to that, so we had to start small. We started on 300 acres that the Shoshone tribe bought in the 80s, even though those lands are within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. Lands were acquired through the General Allotment Act, opened up for homesteading, and so now we're working to raise the money to buy some of those lands back and designate them for buffalo habitat. So that's land rematriation with buffalo restoration. That is a pretty cool concept to think about. But starting small, we brought the very first 10 buffalo in 2016 to the Shoshone tribe, and we brought them to 300 acres. 2017, we had the first calf born, Sundance, and we also, that was in May, and then in October of 2017, we brought 10 more bison from the National Bison Range in Montana. Again, these are all conservation buffalo, no integration. In 2019, we partnered with the Fort Peck tribes. They've been bison, they've been leaders in bison conservation, building a quarantine facility, and we partnered with them to receive 5 bulls because they had the Yellowstone genetics. They'd gone through the quarantine process, certified disease-free, and so we brought 5 bulls. Just recently, a couple weeks ago, and many of the photos that you're seeing are from the latest release, we brought 47 animals from the Dunn Ranch via the Nature Conservancy and the Intertribal Buffalo Council. In 2019, the Northern Arapaho tribe, we just gotten a resolution finally with the Arapaho, and we brought 10 buffalo from the National Bison Range. They also received half of this batch from Missouri. So we got 98 total buffalo on the Wind River Reservation. The Shoshone tribe has 66. The Arapaho tribe has 32. But the goal is thousands of buffalo. And so we continue to uh, build the capacity for acreage. So at the Shoshone Tribe, we're purchasing lands, raising the money to buy land and designate it for buffalo habitat. We assist in the Arapaho tribe to increase the enclosure. But as we implement codes and regulations, similar to how the game code was implemented in the 80s and that protected our wildlife, we need to do that again with buffalo or bison. Get that language into our law so that it can exist on our tribal lands as wildlife. They have that distinction and designation. They don't have to be treated like cattle then. And then eventually we can grow our population to uh, be a sustainable level that we can begin to hunt. And from a conservation standpoint, that target population is 1,000 animals. We have the habitat for more than 1,000, but really reaching 1,000 animals will maintain that genetic heterogeneity that we need to. Also, supplying genetics from other conservation populations will improve the overall genetic health of our herds. And so it's a piecemeal approach to getting thousands of buffalo on thousands of acres, even though right now we're on about 100 buffalo on a couple thousand acres. It's a piecemeal approach to getting something and somewhere down the road where it's going to be much better for our people and the landscape.
I'm certainly excited to see how all of it unfolds. If folks want to learn more or get involved, I think we have another link that we want to share with you guys, nwf.org/give to Buffalo. Please do head there. You can read a little bit more about all the incredible work that Jason is doing and a lot of the things that he's been talking about. And it's also an opportunity for you guys to get involved as well, take some action, support the project so that this dream of getting to 1,000 buffalo on the land can become a reality sooner rather than later. So with that, we are out of time, Jason. I want to thank you again for joining me. And again, just for everything that you're doing. It's such important work. It's really powerful. It's so inspiring. And hope everybody else out there, feels the same way and that you will visit the link and that you'll be on the lookout at that link on all NWF social media for the release date for the feature-length film called Bison Return to Tribal Land that we watched a teaser of earlier in this broadcast. So check that out. And if you missed that, if you didn't join us until the end, go back and rewind because this video will be saved here and definitely watch that. It's pretty powerful stuff. So Jason, until we meet again, have a great afternoon and thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you.